Just saying. Hi, this is Sharon Acoff-Sledge, and I want to reflect on the podcast that was about surveys. And it was interesting. So, in terms of samples and studies, it's very important to properly choose a sample. The cake analogy, what didn't make sense to me, she was saying you wouldn't just take a bite of a cake and determine how the whole cake tastes. She said something about biting from different parts of the cake. You would not really do that. So I just thought that wasn't a really good analogy. But the point that you do have to get samples from different places in order to see, to get an effective view of your data, that made sense to me. And they talked about stratified samples, which was something I didn't think about. That was dividing people up into subgroups and then randomly picking people from those subgroups. So that was a really interesting thing to me, because I'm thinking of the type of sample I would use for my survey for the research paper that we have to do. I teach accelerated. I teach 3 accelerated classes and 1 regular class. And so that would be interesting, seeing how that data varied from accelerated students who mostly don't have a problem retaining data to a regular class. I probably would have to expand it to other teachers' classes. But one thing about the survey structure, in the podcast, they talked about using plain language that the survey participants can understand. And that's true. Even when I do Nielsen surveys sometimes, and if I get bored with it, if they're using a lot of terminology that I'm not accustomed to using, and that's with Nielsen, somebody that does surveys all the time about radio, any kind of media participation and usage. And they said don't use difficult technical jargon. And that makes sense, because something we might use if we're surveying a general public about something, that might not be a term that they're familiar with. And also they said each question should handle one issue at a time. They talked about avoiding questions that kind of tried to cover more than one thing in one question, avoid leading questions. And, when we teach, there are sometimes that, especially in differentiation, we are taught to ask leading questions to help students to develop, to get to a point of analyzing and answering a question. But on a survey, that's not a good thing. One thing they said in the podcast was that well-crafted questions create options in a neutral and balanced way. I thought that was very profound. And the responses that are available to your participants should be clear, comprehensive, and relevant. They talked about having your answer responses such that if it was multiple choice, there would be a clear answer and not, well, maybe this one and maybe that one. They talked about longitudinal studies and cross-sectional studies. One longitudinal study that they talked about in particular was a trend study that looked at how populations change over time. So you collect data over a period of time, whereas a cross-sectional study would collect data at one point in time. Response rate. And I didn't think about this, but low response rate lends itself to biased data. And then a high response rate is essential to the generalization of data. So the higher your response rate, the better. So on the podcast, they said we should use a combination of strategies to ensure that we get accurate responses and a high response rate. And then there is the data analysis once you do your survey. You're going to transform raw data into meaningful results. Clean the data, I wasn't real clear on that. I was thinking about maybe extraneous data and different things, or data points that are obviously flawed, but I need to look more into that. And then after that, they said after you clean your data, look at overall patterns using descriptive statistics like mean, medium, median, mode, different things like that. And then inferential statistics for a deeper dive into your data. Now, the one that got me, I love anecdotes, I love stories, I love history. So they talked about the Literary Digest poll. And this is the most famous example of how not to do a study. I found it on a website. They talked about it on the podcast, but I had to go, as they were talking about it, I had to go and look it up. And I found a website that the biggest historical statistical blunders. And that was Landon versus FDR. And Literary Digest poll predicted that Alf Landon would win over FDR 57% to 43%. And in reality, Roosevelt won 62% to 37%. And as you take a deeper dive into how they did this study, it was like, wow. The survey sample was taken from the phone directory, driver's registrations, that means people who own cars, and country club memberships. And this was during the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, they eliminated the people who were mostly affected by the Great Depression and asked who they would vote for. They sent out 10 million sample ballots and only 24% that was returned. So that's not a very high return rate. So you have to think about those 75% who did not return their surveys. Out of 10 million people, this is a huge survey. What were they thinking? So this sample was biased towards the wealthy during the Great Depression. And the survey captured no effects from people who were affected by the Great Depression, which was the group most likely to vote for FDR. So the people who were suffering, the poorer people who were going through because of the Great Depression, were just left out of the study. And only the wealthy, the well-to-do, were surveyed. And one thing that I read when I was looking up online about it, reading online about it, was that a survey with a low response rate is always subject to the non-response bias. So those 75 to 76% of people who did not respond, that was a built-in bias. And this is a lesson that even a massive survey, 10 million people, can go awry if the sampling is bad. And then, of course, this is when we learned in our history classes, Dewey defeats Truman. All the newspapers declared that Dewey defeated Truman, but that was not true. They were going by their polls, even a Gallup poll. So 3 major polls predicted that Dewey would win over Truman, but the problem was they stopped the survey too soon and their sample was not a good sampling. They also did not account for the 15% of the undecided votes. They decided that the 15% would be split equally between Dewey and Truman, and that was not true. They actually went to Truman. So they stopped the survey too soon, and so Truman had time to sway the undecided towards him once he saw the polls. And then they used telephone polls as one of their survey methods, which favored the wealthy. And then they sent pollsters into an area and they would say, okay, you need to pick 3 Black people, 2 women, 1 this, 1 that, 1 the other. And so they were trying to get a good cross-section of participants. But however, the pollsters had the choice of the people that they would pick to survey. So bias from the pollsters was introduced. And as history tells us, Truman defeated Dewey. Thank you for listening.